an investigation of transformations of the image, or more precisely, of our habitual ways of perceiving and interpreting images, brought about by the introduction and the development of the mass media over more than a century, requires that we first characterize the specific modes of reception of the image that have undergone change. Here, any number of examples might serve our purpose, but I will focus on what I take to be a particularly illustrative example, drawn at once from the oeuvre and from the reflections on painting elaborated by the celebrated 18th century French painter, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, 1755 to 1842. Wrong one. At the beginning of her Souvenir, first published in 1835, the sixth letter, she recounted a trip she took to Flanders with her husband. Can you not hear? Oh, I'm not ready for that one yet. I just wanted to make sure the machine was working. It is working. That's not her anyway. At the beginning of her Souvenir, first published in 1835, she recounted a trip that she took to Flanders with her husband in 1782, during which she was deeply moved by a painting of Peter Paul Rubens. Now we can actually show it. That she discovered in Antwerp, Rubens' Woman with the Straw Hat. Vigée-Lebrun believed that it portrayed Rubens' wife, but it most probably represents Susanna Lunden, who became his second wife several years later. In this sixth letter of her Souvenir, I would like to quote a few sentences of Vigée-Lebrun about painting. She writes about this painting particularly, the portrait in a straw hat. Its great effect is due to the two different kinds of light given by simple daylight and by the glimmer of the sun. Thus the clear tones face the sun and what must be called shadows, for lack of another word. They are rendered by daylight. Perhaps one must be a painter to judge the full merit of what Rubens has accomplished. This painting delighted me and inspired me to such a point that I did my own portrait in Brussels while trying to create the same effect. I painted myself wearing a straw hat on my head, a feather and a garland of wild flowers holding my hand on the palette. Vigée-Lebrun's words are indeed those of a painter, which directly concern the nature of images and the way in which Rubens was able to create them. Her narrative accounts so effectively for the variety and the vivacity of what is shown in the image and its personal aspects that one readily believes her claim that it is necessary to be a painter to fully appreciate Rubens's great merit. During this same period, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun had begun work on a series of portraits of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. And her comments concerning the task of representing the Queen, above all in regard to the relation between the person portrayed and the painting image, will permit us to situate our initial question concerning the nature of the image itself. I quote her a second time from her Souvenir, a little bit later on. Vigée-Lebrun writes, "It was in the year 1779 that I first painted the portrait of the Queen, who at that time radiated in the splendor of her youth and her beauty. It is very difficult to convey an idea to someone who has never seen the Queen of such grace and nobility combined. Her features were not at all regular. She had received from her family the long and thin oval face that is particular to the Austrian nation. Her eyes were not at all large. Their color was nearly blue. She looked spiritual and sweet. Her nose was fine and pretty, and her mouth was not at all large, although the lips were a bit full. Yet what was most remarkable in her face was the splendor of her complexion. I have never seen such a bright one, and bright is the word, since her skin was so transparent that it hardly depicted any shade. Thus it was impossible for me to portray it as I would have liked. The colors were lacking to paint such freshness, such fine tones that were particular to this charming face, which I have never seen in any other woman. Vigée Lebrun manifests her evident enthusiasm for a benefactress, however unpopular Marie Antoinette later became, who did much to promote her success. But without paying any attention to this, let us look more closely at one of the portraits themselves, one in which Marie Antoinette is painted holding a rose and wearing a simple dress, which was called at the time a chemisier en gaule. In this painting of 1783, Marie Antoinette looks directly at us. Nothing in the painting, neither jewelry nor regal sign or symbol, tells us that we are in the presence of the Queen of France. When this painting was presented publicly at the Salon, it was harshly criticized, since it did not seem to reflect a sufficiently dignified image of the French Queen, and it was subsequently replaced by a portrait that Vigée Lebrun hastily prepared of Marie Antoinette that portrayed her in a much more traditional attire. Vigée Lebrun's description places in relief a further, more essential aspect of the image she painted. She was able to position herself before a living model and to see her, so to speak, in the flesh, en chair et en os, in den Knochen. She beheld her model in her immediate presence, in a context which, since then, has forever disappeared. And she avows that the representation of this presence depended upon an act of transposition which is capable only in a very limited manner of retrieving the sensuous plenitude of what she directly beheld. The colors, as she writes, were lacking. Here, Vigée Lebrun gives testimony to the evident gap that separates any portrait from the sensuous plenitude of what it represents. In placing in relief this gap, she highlights the primordial status of direct encounters in the life world, which all artistic representations presuppose. Beyond traditional portraits and attempts to mirror the plenitude of the sensuous world through painted images, we might also invoke as possible topics of art entirely fictive productions or the abstract art of our period. These productions may create worlds of their own and which obey unique principles of spatial configuration. Yet they are not able, any more than traditional portraits, to abolish the unbridgeable gap that lies between painted images and the life world of everyday experience. If we characterize the attempt to represent what is given in the sensuous plenitude of the life world, I believe that we must accord a primordial status to direct encounters in an environing world in the sense that Edmund Husserl gave to this term in qualifying it as experience in the flesh in the context of a living present. Leibhafte Erfahrung in einer jeweiligen lebendigen Gegenwart. Granted that all perceptual acts are constituted from the perspective of the observer, their primordiality stems not from a supposed contact they provide with a reality independent of this perspective and of the observer, but because they are presupposed by all other secondary forms of experience and of remembrance. A second characteristic of the image concerns its relation to articulated language. It has often been said that art is a form of language. And it is true that articulated speech, through its descriptive power, is capable, like the image, of transposing the sensuous fullness of original experience into a communicable form. But here, the similarity between the language and the image must be qualified. Every linguistic expression is necessarily tied to the particular language in which it is expressed and to the linguistic community that is capable of understanding it. The phrases of a language are not only incomprehensible to all who have not learned it, but as we are well aware, it takes on specific connotations and nuances that depend on its context of elaboration, which are modified as soon as it is translated into other languages. Of course, the image also bears the traces of the context from which it arises, as the representations of Susanna Lunden, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and Marie Antoinette clearly illustrate. At least by virtue of the style of the painting through which they are portrayed, the appearance of clothing and demeanor which are today anachronistic, or at least not customary. Yet, even if the image may reflect its context of elaboration, it is not tied to this context in the manner of linguistic expression. It reaches beyond this context and is capable of communicating meaning through its capacity to directly evoke the sensuous nuances of the life world it portrays. In regard to its context of elaboration and of reception, the image displays a particular aesthetic pregnance. And here I come into the proximity of what Professor Bredekamp calls the build act. We can talk about this in the discussion. I'm using the term aesthetische Prägnanz to talk precisely about this extra-linguistic fullness of the image. Of course, the word aesthetic here has to be taken in its original Greek sense as aesthesis, what is immediately given to the senses. Aesthetic pregnance understood in conjunction with this Greek root. We don't need to know who the painter Vigée-Lebrun was, neither the country from which she originated, nor her socio-cultural milieu, nor even her historical role, to be immediately struck by the beauty of her painting. And inversely, whatever linguistic description might be given, whatever we might know concerning her identity as a painter and her impact on European culture in her period, this can never serve as a substitute for the image that is represented on the canvas. I can talk to you about it all day long, and it can never replace what you see. The image is not one language among others. The immediacy of its sensuous presence is laden, pregnant, with the visual texture of the life world from which it emerges. And if it is incapable of retrieving the fullness of its original sensuous plenitude, it nonetheless communicates a unique sense that spontaneously bursts beyond the confines of all linguistic and cultural frameworks. If I have briefly identified these two characteristics of the image by means of examples drawn from the period of the European Ancien Régime, it is in order to better set in relief the transformations that the image and our ways of perceiving images underwent in a later period. Beginning in the second half of the 19th century, the emergence of mass societies and of mass communications greatly augmented the distance between individuals and small groups. Oh, yeah, I'll take it back. The emergence of mass societies and of mass communications greatly augmented the distance between individuals and small groups in the context of the everyday life world from the public realm, that for all but a tiny number of political agents lay beyond the purview of everyday experience. To an ever-increasing extent, to use Helmut Plessner's apt term, the sphere of communal familiarity, Sphäre gemeinschaftlicher Vertrautheit, typical of smaller societies often set in rural or small-town environments, was exchanged for the anonymity of relations that predominate in huge urban centers. For populations originating from a diversity of backgrounds, epitomized by the plurality of multilinguistic and multicultural conglomerations, the public visibility of the image had the capacity of spontaneously establishing lines of contact between the everyday experience of individuals and smaller groups and the public realm that reached ever further beyond their direct experience. Here, mass communications, first associated with journalism and then with the cinema, television, video, and followed by today's digital technology, introduced novel forms of organization and of communication which accord to the image and to the culture of the image an ever more preponderant role. Even before the large-scale use of photography, the mass production of images was introduced in the form of sketches drawn by war correspondents at the front. The sketch heightens the impression of eyewitness presence at events and of the ability to directly communicate them on the basis of experience, so to speak, in the flesh. This practice began with the Crimean War of 1854 and became still more common during the Civil War in the United States and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. And here you have a very good example, Edwin Forbes' famous sketch of the Battle of Antietam that was of extreme importance in bringing to the newspaper readers of the time the vivacity of this incredible battle that decided the outcome of the American Civil War. It's not visible? What's the problem? None, okay. At the end of the 19th century, photography that was introduced to illustrate mass circulation newspapers reinforced the capacity of the image to substantiate reports on the basis of immediate eyewitness presence. And this capacity increased substantially with each progressive technical innovation that the news media came to employ. Film and news clips, video, and our hyper-mediated CNN-like formats that give an ever more vivid impression of direct presence at reported events. Each technical advance, from sketch and still photo to moving pictures and video, perfects the capacity to visually simulate direct experience in the immediate life world and to confer upon it public visibility. Each advance provides a more effective manner of bringing selected events before the public eye and of making them resonate in public memory. According to the argument I develop in my recent work, Collective Memory in the Historical Past, it is here that we find the paradox that characterizes the contemporary culture of the image. The latest marvels in digital technology are no more capable than the painted image of bridging the gap between virtual representations and the life world they are meant to convey. Indeed, the capacity to simulate direct apprehension ever more closely draws its potency from an uncanny ability to dissimulate the gap that separates representations from the immediate life world in which they originate. This is one of the major points I try to make. The capacity to simulate direct apprehension ever more closely draws its potency from an uncanny ability to dissimulate the gap that separates representations from the immediate life world from which they stem. This consideration leads us to the specific question concerning transformations in the visual image that the format of mass reproduction has favored. In what sense might we identify a metamorphosis of the image, or at least of our habitual ways of apprehending images? In what way might this transformation concern the sense they communicate by virtue of their unique ability to convey sensuous presence beyond the confines of a cultural or linguistic context? The metamorphosis of the image and of our modes of reception of images is tied to a broader mutation in communicated information that has taken place during the contemporary era of the mass media. This metamorphosis has been propelled by the general change in the modes of production and consumption inaugurated by the emergence of mass society since the end of the 19th century. In the frame of technical reproducibility, the image may incorporate the kind of anonymity and impersonality that is typical of products of mass consumption more generally. In the first decade of the 20th century, the sociologist Georg Simmel, in his book, The Philosophy of Money, characterized this anonymity of mass consumer products in the following manner. And perhaps I'll read the German text since I have the English up there, and his German is much better than my English. Je sachlicher, unpersönlicher ein Produkt ist, für desto mehr Menschen ist es geeignet. Damit der Konsum des Einzelnen ein so breites Material finden könne, muss dieses sehr vielen Individuen eingängig und anziehend gemacht, kann nicht auf subjektive Differenziertheiten des Begehrens angelegt sein, während andererseits gerade nur die äußerste Differenzierung der Produktion imstande ist, die Objekte so billig und massenhaft herzustellen, wie es der Umfang des Konsums fordert. A fantastic passage from the Philosophy of Money. In terms of the image, the adaptation to mass production leads in similar fashion to uniformization and standardization. This process assumed a striking form, above all in the industry where it began to play a central role, that of mass circulation newspapers. In the context of newspaper journalism, the image takes on new form insofar as it obeys a logic that characterizes this medium more generally. Walter Benjamin, in his essay über einige Motive by Baudelaire, on some motifs in Baudelaire, identified what he took to be the principles of information in journalism, which are, according to him, novelty, briefness, comprehensibility, and above all, the absence of connection between the different news items. Zusammenhangslosigkeit. These principles accord well with Georg Simmel's conception of anonymity and impersonality of products of mass consumption. At the same time, if the logic of mass production and consumption of journalistic information had a profound impact on the configuration of the image, this was because it has been propelled by subtle and often unnoticed ways through which we structure and integrate the perceptual world. One of the great accomplishments of art in the 20th century has been to bring these subtle changes before the public eye in a way which at once reflects transformations of the mass media and has at the same time exercised a notable influence on them. A whole series of iconographic works which explore the symbolic possibilities of journalistic principles of configuration illustrates this. From the works of Georges Barash or of Kurt Schwitters, Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol, to the more recent art of Melissa Gordon, Martine Hugonnier, Olaf Metzel, or Marcus Lupertz, just to give a few examples of explorations with newspapers and the newspaper format. This brings us then to the decisive point. When it is fashioned as a product of mass consumption, the image retains its communicative power, its aesthetic pregnance, beyond linguistic and cultural barriers, while at the same time takes on a novel configuration and a new manner of presence. This novel form adapts itself to the anonymous and decontextualized logic of production favored by mass publicity and advertising more generally. This novel form is that of the stereotypical image, the key image, Schlüsselbild, which is a preferred mode of communication in the vast contemporary public sphere. In a seminal essay published in 1920, Pagan Antique Prophecy in Words and Images in the Age of Luther, Abby Warburg referred to the production of stereotypical images, which he termed Schlagbilder, at the time of the first printing presses, which were diffused in pamphlets during Luther's Reformation. As he wrote, and I quote Abby Warburg, these stereotypical images were particularly effective since they were spontaneously comprehensible on an international scale. They transcend the realm of cultural and linguistic confines. In the context of the 20th century and of 20th century mass production and consumption, the key image has become an important area of exploration by a great number of artists, from Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp to Sonia Delaunay, Hannah Huch, Kurt Schwitters, Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Rauschenberg, or Andy Warhol, to name only the best known among them. Their works place in evidence the principles of configuration of mass-produced key images, which I identify with novelty, anonymity, decontextualization, and the absence of correlation between different elements, Zusammenhangslosigkeit. Art places in relief the aesthetic pregnance of such icons and the symbolic potency that their communication may unleash. Kurt Schwitter's work presents a paradigmatic exploration of the resonances of the key image. In many of his characteristic assemblages, newspaper articles are presented alone, alongside seemingly unrelated objects that are juxtaposed to reveal the absence of direct relation between them. They often highlight haphazardness, not only as a mode of ordinary empirical appearance, but above all as a format of configuration of public accounts aligned in newspaper columns. Beauty is not portrayed through the unique radiance of the individualized portrait. incorporated notably by the feminine form in traditional art, but as the anonymous, commercialized beauty of illustrated weeklies and other kinds of mass-circulated publication, as you can see very clearly here. If we take, for example, the suggestive collage Carnival, exhibited today in the Yale University Art Museum, the smiling female portrait conforms in dress, hairstyle, and expression to the fashion of the times as portrayed by mass-produced advertisements. As if to highlight the anonymity both of the image and of the public that beholds it, the eyes of the woman's smiling face are blindfolded. Next to this image, and at an oblique angle, another symbolic configuration of the female face appears in the form of a comic strip parody, alongside of which fragments of undecipherable printed newspaper columns highlight the disjointedness of these different items of mass communication in accord with the structure of the mass media format more generally. The later works of Andy Warhol also present, here we could also show, the later works of Andy Warhol also present explorations of the iconic potency of the key image. Like Roy Lichtenstein, he was educated as a commercial and graphic artist, and his production of such images as Marilyn Monroe, men on the FBI's most wanted list, sports heroes like Jack Nicklaus or O.J. Simpson have become particularly famous. These key images are weak in political content, and their anonymity come closest to mass-produced commercial logos. At the other side of the spectrum stand those images that are so fully permeated by the socio-political symbolic connotations of their context that their ideological message has been made unambiguous for vast groups that receive them. Here I think not so much of Robert Rauschenberg, but for example the famous Adams photograph of the fleeing children at a napalm dropping in Vietnam, which you simply, there's nothing ambiguous about that particular photograph. But and so not all photographs or not all images are simply applicable to the category of key images, but many are. My purpose in dealing with key images, Schlüsselbilder, however, is to focus directly on the free-floating potential, freischwebend, I love the word in German, free-floating potential of images imbued with an aesthetic pregnance reaching beyond the context in which they emerge. In its free-floating versatility, the sense of such key images changes in relation to its context of presentation and reception. As publicly reproduced images on a global scale, key images are both immediately recognizable and indeterminate in content. As images, they are pregnant with different connotations rooted in the corresponding networks of embodied symbols that are retained in collective memory and that orient the interpretation of experience in the different contexts in which they are deployed. As icons, they reveal a central trait governing the spatio-temporal pattern and the visual logic of the mass-produced image as it is communicated in the public sphere. In its decontextualized form and free-floating aesthetic pregnance, it draws immediate recognition without necessarily conveying a more determinate sense rooted in the original experiential world from which it emerges. This free-floating potential of key images is deployed at multiple levels of public communication and reveals the deep affinity shared by political, artistic, and commercial ways of bringing images before the public eye. Consider in this light 3 examples of the key image, which will serve to further illustrate its ambiguous function. As a first example, I take a key image that is so universally known that it's become almost trite. The first example is presented by the ubiquitous images of Che Guevara, which provide a paradigmatic illustration of the key image's function. The photo of Che Guevara, which was originally taken in 1960 by the Cuban photographer Alberto Corda Diaz, while Che was listening to a speech by Fidel Castro in Havana, was initially invested with political significance, as it was subsequently displayed at political rallies and demonstrations or in student dormitories. This political meaning was eventually broadened and diluted as it was adopted in clothing styles as an eye-grabbing symbol of fashionable chic, and was accorded further commercial significance when Smirnoff used it in advertising vodka. Here you see the famous work of Gerard Malanga, which he tried to pass off as an Andy Warhol work, lithograph. He tried to pass it off in Rome, and the art dealer became very suspicious and began making inquests. And so Gerard Malanga, who knew Warhol very well, called him up on the telephone and said, listen, I'm in big trouble. I tried to pass off my Che Guevara as one of your works. And Warhol said to him, oh, that's no problem. You can just tell him I did it, but send me the money. Send me the royalties, which is in fact what happened. And of course, here's the famous bloody Smirnoff. By the way, to give you an idea, in Cuba there was no such thing as a copyright. It was a communist country. They didn't have any place for copyrights. But when Smirnoff took this as a key image to sell vodka, all of a sudden the law changed in Cuba, and copyrights were introduced as a means of suing Smirnoff, and Smirnoff lost the trial, by the way, and they were not allowed to show this anymore. So it gives you an idea of the incredible versatility and ambiguity of such images. As icons, key images reveal a central trait governing the spatio-temporal pattern and the visual logic of the mass-produced image as it is communicated in the public sphere. In its anonymity, its decontextualized form and free-floating pregnance, it draws immediate recognition without necessarily conveying a more determinate sense. Here I come to my second example, which is much less well known in Western Europe and in the United States, but is an extremely important example for me. It's this painting. It's a painting that was made in 1919, entitled the Kosovo Maidan, that was painted by Uroš Predić in 1919 and is now in the Belgrade National Museum in Serbia. Since its creation, this work has served as a noteworthy symbol, both in artistic representation and as a key image disseminated by the mass media in southeastern Europe. It is set on the Amstelfeld battlefield, following the famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, in which the Serbs and their allies were vanquished by the Ottoman invaders and subsequently lost their independence for a period of almost 5 centuries. The painting depicts a scene in which the kneeling Kosovo maiden, who is searching for her fiancé, encounters one of his wounded comrades, and while giving him a drink of water, learns of her fiancé's death. The battle and the legend of the Kosovo maiden provided a motif that was elaborated in Serbian epic poetry in the Middle Ages. In the form of an oral tradition, it took on a mythical aura in the collective memory of the Serbs and other Balkan peoples over a period of centuries, and was set into written verse in the 19th century. In fact, Herder was a great enthusiast of Serbian epic poetry, as was Goethe and Leopold von Ranke and Walter Scott. The later painting of Uroš Predić, which was created just after World War I and the victory of the Serbs and their Western allies, became a national symbol very quickly. For our purposes, its use in recent times serves to illustrate the plasticity and the aesthetic pregnance of the image, especially in the mass-produced forms of the key image as it has been received in different epochs among different ethnic communities. During the reign of Josip Broz Tito in the post-World War II period, who brought about a brief period of Yugoslav national unity and a corresponding attempt to attenuate national differences, it was possible to imbue the image of the Kosovo Maidan with a trans-regional significance which could be communicated across the chasm that separated different national communities. This is illustrated, for example, by the choice in 1983 by the Serbian pop group Bijelo Dugme of a reproduction of the painting of Uroš Predić to adorn the front jacket of one of their albums. This album was a great success among the different ethnic groups of what was then Yugoslavia, and in the Balkans more generally, even in Greece, at least in part because it followed a previous album which featured a song entitled Kosovka, which I am told connotes at once the song of the Kosovo and the maiden of the Kosovo, Kosovka. And the originality of this song lay in the fact that it was sung not in the customary Serbo-Croatian language, but in Albanian, which favored its popularity beyond Serbian borders. As a product of mass consumption, the plastic key image of the Kosovo Maiden could convey a funky, multi-ethnic message to the Baltic region as a whole. In 1989, as the Yugoslav nation was undergoing a process of disintegration, Slobodan Milosevic delivered his ominous Gazimestan speech on the Amstelfeld battle site where the Ottoman Empire had wrought its victory exactly day to day, day for day, 600 years earlier. In subsequent months and years, whatever multi-ethnic function key images such as the Kosovo Maiden might have assumed were quickly overshadowed by nationalist connotations. In its ambiguity and plasticity as a key image, the Kosovo Maiden could be mobilized to serve ideological ends that then became much less ambiguous. This brings me to my third example, and most troubling example. Provided by a globally publicized response to the wars to which such regional nationalism led. In particularly radical form, the Benetton publicity campaign of Oliviero Toscani illustrates the intrinsic dynamic of images which the mass media bring to public visibility and disseminate on a global scale. I remember the image that I'm going to show you. I remember walking down in the 1990s, must have been 1995, walking down to the Paris metro and seeing this on a poster. You know, so this is really something incredibly troubling. In a publicity campaign, photographer and graphic designer Oliviero Toscani, by means of well-known shock images, promoted Benetton clothing in an effort to direct public awareness toward social issues. His goal was to expose a whole range of social taboos. One of those campaigns was undertaken in 1994 during the Bosnian War, when Toscani attempted to illustrate the absurdity and the cruelty of war through what he called his photographic monument to a known soldier, depicting the young Marinko Gagro, who had been killed in action and was represented in the photo only by his blood-stained clothing and an accompanying typed comment of the soldier's father. Neither his uniform nor the content of his father's message, which is barely even visible and is written in Serbo-Croatian, call attention to the specific country or cause for which he fought, and highlight above all the loss his death represented. The image was thoroughly decontextualized, and the anonymity of Toscani's mode of depicting his death was highlighted by the ambiguity of its message. A scene of horror that was publicly displayed in the form of an advertisement for clothing. As Toscani himself stated, this ambiguity was underscored by a group of young Sarajevo graphic designers who wrote to Toscani and described the photo in the following terms. I quote the Serbian graphic designers, the Sarajevo graphic designers, who wrote to Toscani, and Toscani included this in a book that he wrote about the topic. The graphic designers wrote, at the height of the Balkan Wars in 1994-95, we will never know if this poster, concerned with the conflict in our region, is one of the most insolent and cynical reactions, or if, on the contrary, it is not one of the most skillful warnings in regard to this deep and atrocious wound perpetrated by modern civilization, which seems to accord an ever greater role to marketing and communication. Here I come to the conclusion of my talk. The three examples I have evoked are presented to illustrate and highlight the central paradox that I mentioned earlier surrounding the transformations of the image and of its reception that key images exemplify. On one hand, they share a general capacity of images that are technically formatted for mass dissemination to simulate, to an increasing degree of perfection, actions, objects, and events in the life world, and to bring them before the public eye. This is accomplished, on the other hand, not by a simple replication of what they represent, but by ordering them in terms of autonomous modes of spatio-temporal and logical configuration imposed by the mass media format that has become the ubiquitous source of communication in the public sphere. In their ambiguity, images and hypermediated messages that accompany them are the paradigmatic expression of the distance from contextually embedded ways of perceiving and interpreting experience in the everyday life world. Certainly, images and hypermediated messages are by no means sealed off from the life world they strive to represent. And indeed, they exercise upon it a potent and often overbearing influence. The ambiguity of images, of which the key image is a paradigmatic expression, and the multiplicity of their modes of reception signal what is largely experienced as a growing opacity of the public world in its radical distance from the life world that surrounds it. My purpose in making this point and in concluding in this manner is intended less as an exploration of the novel ways in which art in the contemporary period has both revealed the novel functions of the image and also contributed to their propagation. I would like to suggest at the same time that interaction in one way or another with the mass media format of configuration and dissemination identifies only one aspect of the visual arts in the contemporary period. And I would like to open the discussion by evoking the emergence of unprecedented expressions of image creation in recent decades, profoundly rooted in the innovations of 20th century visual art, which it would be difficult to assimilate to the format of mass dissemination that has become such a central feature of the contemporary culture of the image. It is art that may be qualified by an aesthetic pregnance that resists reduction to stereotypes. In the quest for the brute immediacy of appearance, the emphasis of this art is most often on concrete expressions of the experiential world that are not adaptable to the format of anonymous productions, for they draw on a pre-reflexive and anti-predicative dimension of experience before any imposition of ready-made visual symbols. And I, in conclusion, show you, to open the discussion, 3 examples. The first is a work of Paul Jenkins called Phenomena Anvil Wedge that he did in 2008, and in which he stated his purpose was precisely to draw on the work world of everyday experience, the fire and the sparks of the blacksmith shop, but in a way that brought out their immediacy and even their anti-predicative, their pre-reflexive, pre-conceptual, pre-linguistic presence. I think it's a fantastic example. I was at an exhibition about 15 years ago, before he actually did this painting, but a whole series of paintings at Smirnoff in France, and where they had a retrospective. And he talked about his desire precisely to get back to this preconceptual, this pre-linguistic layer of experience that is our immediate openness to the world of everyday experience. I think this wonderfully exemplifies this intention. Another example would be this fantastic series by Cy Twombly in 1963, 9 discourses on Commodus. Commodus, who was the son of Marcus Aurelius, became emperor of Rome, and due to different plots that were made against his life, he himself became a terrible murderer, and just murdered everybody who came close to him and seemed to be threatening. And then he, of course, was himself murdered. There's a wonderful, poignant description of this in the decline and fall of Rome, that in fact Cy Twombly was reading at the time when he actually created this. Just a few words to say that when you look at the painting, you're not really sure. There's an extraordinary, there are actually nine of them. There's an incredible aesthetic attraction to the painting. They really have a certain beauty and an aura that they communicate. On the other hand, you can see that the implicit violence that is there. That, and when they were first shown, it was in New York in 1964. I think it was January, February 1964, in a gallery, and they had this big gallery showing 3 months after the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And so you can imagine the reception of these 9 images, very violent, showing assassination and blood and gore. I mean, they were a complete flop. Cy Twombly apparently stopped painting for 2 years. He was so upset by the reaction. And the critics were just assassinated him in a figurative way. So, I mean, this is the kind of, it would be very difficult to assimilate this to any kind of stereotypical image as far as I consider it. Another fantastic example that reminds me of the films that we just saw. I didn't make a comment on that because I was going to, I'm making it now, precisely because the proximity between one of the films and these fantastic photographs of Ellsworth Kelly. In fact, there are 2 of them that I saw in New York in 2016 in this private gallery. I didn't even know Ellsworth Kelly took photographs. I knew his painting and his graphic works, but I had never seen photographs of Ellsworth Kelly. And so they had maybe 20 photographs in this gallery. And they're absolutely amazing because they're amazing in the sense that you're wondering if you're seeing a photograph or a painting of Ellsworth Kelly. His eye, in seeing what he was looking at, so closely approximated what he created as a visual image in his painting. It is absolutely astounding that he was able to do this. Of course, these are reproductions, photo reproductions. When you see the actual photos, you have the idea of the texture and the grain. Of course, he developed them in the darkroom. And so you have this feeling of texture and grain and looking at them. That one of the films also communicated, which I think gets us back to this pre-reflexive, this inner realm of communication that I want to highlight as another possible avenue of artistic exploration in the 21st century. Thank you very much. So is the format to ask questions or? Yes, okay. Very good. No, anybody who has questions, I'd be very pleased to answer. Anything that you might, or comments or questions or criticisms, I'm open to, because this is a big, the last part of it, of course, is something completely new that I wrote over the last 2 weeks. The earlier part are parts that came out in my chapter in the mass media, but are illustrated by the paintings of Vigée Lebrun and Rubens. That's not in the book, but the ideas are there. And yes.
Do you want the mic, or do you want to speak?
Maybe. Thank you for bringing us this whole history of how images were produced and put forward in society. It made me think that as long as I can remember, even going back to like elementary school, I was always told that we are being overwhelmed by images. There's so many images in our society, in our world, we can't pay attention to them one at a time. There's so many. And yet every few years, it seems to 10 times more images. Such that we see so many things streaming by today. But is this sense of being overwhelmed always been there? Even going back to these paintings of Marie Antoinette, were they still worrying about it then, that there was too many images and we can't keep track? Or is this really just happening now, and that we can barely realize how in 20 years, how many more images will be inflicted upon us?
Absolutely incredible. The most incredible thing for me, and here I'm thinking of the book of Grusin and Bolter called Hypermediation, which for me was a great inspiration in my theory of the media. And Grusin and Bolter bring out this notion of hypermediation. When you look at, of course, they wrote their book in 2001, and when you look now at the tablets we use, and the hypermediated images are a world that we live in, basically. We inhabit this world of hypermediation in a way that has completely changed the way in which we receive images in general. It's just amazing. And they go into this very well. The way of simulating immediacy through an interface is something I think that has changed the way in which we even interact together in a common world. I think this is something that philosophers over the next 20 years are going to be, exploring increasingly, and also the political way in which this mode of inhabiting a world of images and hypermediated images has changed the configurations of public space in general. I mean, there's so many examples to be given, including the social media, and which has become, I heard this on the radio as I was driving to Marseille yesterday. I was listening to the news, and there was an interview with somebody who was talking about Facebook and saying that this is the primary way in which young Americans get their information. I mean, they don't listen to the news on the radio, but they turn on Facebook and look at the different things that are available. It's an incredibly important development, it seems to me, the way that we inhabit this hyper-mediated realm, this interspace that joins us together and separates us precisely because it is not a direct encounter in a world of everyday immediacy that is in fact the context of our everyday life world. I think that the difference between them, the specific difference between them, and the way in which this hyper-mediated format in fact configures, doesn't replicate, as I said, but it configures the spatio-temporal patterns and logic that is separate from the contextual logic of the life world we inhabit normally in our everyday experience. our face-to-face encounters with one another. Yes, please.
First of all, thanks for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to focus in on one very specific issue you raised early in it about a sort of asymmetry between language and visual art. And the suggestion, if I understood it rightly, was that for understanding language, you need a very local contextual information. It's a very laborious process to understand there. Whereas there's a certain sort of immediacy that comes with the image. And I wanted to sort of push a little bit on what sort that might be. There's one way in which I guess one's going to want to say something like that. You don't have to learn a language in order to understand an image, at least not to get any kind of grip on it. Precisely. Whereas you do with text or with discourse. But if we sort of discount for that, you know, and sort of take the translation as happened, as it were, is there really much asymmetry beyond that? So here's the suggestion, and this is something you're profoundly familiar with, of course. So one of the things you might say about the way art historians have, and to some extent philosophers have, developed in their understanding of visual art in the 20th century is by seeing that the immediacy of the comprehensibility of visual art is really an illusion. It's you think you understand what's going on, you really most of the time don't.
Exactly.
And that's partly because the same kind of context dependency that you're talking about for language is also there with art. And indeed, to suggest a further aspect of it, again connected with the way in which art may be or be like language, it may be that actually you do, in the end, have to take the language and all of its context into account in order even to understand the visual image.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful example of this I mean, this is speaking against my sort of heroes, you know, but you know, Herder takes anthropomorphic images of the gods and of course human beings themselves in Greek sculpture, and he infers from this a kind of commitment to the ideal of humanity, as he calls it. So something like, you know, kind, humane values, something like cosmopolitanism and so on. And I think, you know, this is in one of his later pieces. I don't think this is his best moment, really. I think, you know, what one ought to say about that is something like, well, are you so sure that that's what those images of, you know, wonderful figures and some human beings was conveying? And secondly, actually, we don't have to guess about this. Why not? Well, because we can go to the literature, the texts of the time, and what we will find is actually there's a kind of ambiguity between moral views in the 5th century and the 4th century. You know, some people are working towards a kind of cosmopolitan ideal with the Cynics and the Stoics by the 4th century. Others completely not. I mean, Plato in the 5th book of the Republic, you know, you can do whatever the hell you like to barbarians.
Yes.
And similarly with the sort of, as it were, the prescriptions, regardless vis-a-vis whom that are being conveyed. I mean, is it kind treatment? Is it generous treatment? Is it so, or is it perhaps some sort of pride and ego, and, you know, is it Homeric values basically, or is it proto-Christian ones? So you can actually figure this out, but you have to go to the text to do it. And the message you would probably end up coming back with about the art is, well, you know, probably sometimes it's the one, sometimes it's the other. Depends on the patron, depends on the artist. There's going to be an equivalent ambiguity in the message conveyed by the image. But all of that requires you to do just the same kind of close reading of language in order to begin to really understand the image.
Yes.
That
That's
you
a very
have to
good
do for
point.
language itself.
That's a very good point. It's an extremely difficult. I'm interested in Professor Bredekamp's use of the concept of the build act, this activity of the image, which I fully agree with. I think it's a very important way of talking about, and I think that it comes very close. I have to think more about the threefold articulation of the build act and the way that it comes very close. It's in the proximity, in any case, of this notion of aesthetic pregnance, but this is something that, of course, he would be able to answer much better. As far as that question, you're absolutely right in bringing up Plato. Plato, in one of the dialogues, who says, who favors the dialogue and says, this is the dialogical structure in which we are face to face, and we're talking, I'm bringing out of you ideas, and you are bringing them out of me. And so we are together in our dialogue going toward a higher truth. Whereas the written text, as soon as you write down the text, it becomes he doesn't use the word anonymous, but it's precisely what he's saying. You write down the text, and you don't know who's going to read it. You don't know if the person who's going to read it is going to understand it, how it's going to be, and it's an incredibly important point. The important point being that you can't say to the person, oh, you have misunderstood me. This is the way you should read it, because the author is no longer there. All you have are the written words. For me, the most incredible example of the tie between language and context is Walter Benjamin's translation of Proust, À la recherche du temps perdu, which in the French text is something just absolutely incredible. The images that it produces, the images that are not just images, they're just reminiscences of childhood that come out of the person who's reading the text, but it's so tied to the French language. There's something so French in it. And when you look at the way Benjamin translates, it's a fantastic translation, but it's obviously something different. It's something that also has a power, but the power is different. It's somehow not Proust, but it's something else. And of course, that's true of poetry in general. But I mean, Proust is such an incredible example. And the third point being that you're absolutely right, that the way that I see it, the way that I analyze it in my book, collective memory is always fragmented. There's no such thing as a monolith. It's always fragmented according to the group perspective of the rememberers, which means that the reception of the image is always going to be seen from the perspective not only of the individual, but of the group and the linguistic community and the different attitudes, styles, gestures that are typical of that community that are somehow going to influence the way in which images are received. Take the example of Olivero Toscani, that famous image that I was shocked the first time I saw it going down into the Paris metro. It won a graphics art prize in Tokyo, and it was banned in Los Angeles. So you get an idea that somehow in a Japanese context, at least the people who gave the prize, they saw more the impact and the incredible force. And in fact, the way in which Toscani aimed to denounce war as an absurdity. And this is what was seen in the Japanese context. Whereas in this context in Los Angeles, it was the shock and the idea that, oh, we're selling clothing with an image of death. And so that according to the community in which it's received, I don't want to be monolithic in talking about communities, but nonetheless, there's a kind of a general or typical reaction among different groups that illustrates this incredible fragmentation of perspective.
I just want to add to your comment that there, we were talking already this morning about it during breakfast.
Yes.
That there are different levels how I can receive an image, and that there is the level of what you call language, what I would describe as code, like for example as the dress code of Marie Antoinette or something like that. If I don't know this dress code, this level of the image doesn't come to me. I can't receive it. Exactly. This is for sure. So the same goes with cultural contexts and everything. But my point is, I mean, I didn't invent it, but it's a important point in my work, and I will talk about it tomorrow, is that I think that we can receive images in a very unmittelbaren, in a ganz unmittelbaren Art und Weise, because I have a body, And so, because I have a body, I have an immediate access to zur Materialität, die gezeigt wird auf dem Bild, oder zu den Farben, die es gibt, die zu sehen sind auf dem Bild, oder zu der Dynamik, zu der Bewegungsdynamik der Körper und so weiter, die eingefangen sind. In der Malerei noch stärker in der Plastik, finde ich. And this, so I have to switch between English and German because it's too complicated to me, some ideas to convey or to transport in English. And I think this is an important thing, that certain images have a direct impact and a universal approach to us.
Thank you. Just one comment on that. There's a fabulous passage in Hegel's Aesthetics in which he talks about clothing. And he says that, you know, if you see a nude body, you have very little information about, but as soon as you have a clothed body, you have all sorts of, Roland Barthes in his fabulous book on fashion cites Hegel's passage on clothing and takes it much further in his own analysis. But I think it's a fantastic example. Professor Bredekamp, I think you wanted to,
fully underline what you brought forward. These terms, pregnancy, I will talk about in the afternoon. And I will not talk what I gave into my preposition about the coup d'oeil. That would be the answer to Forster. You argued that there is a deep difference between media photographies and reality, and that you need a reflexive attitude to have a sense of what you talk about, real body schema reception. This is, of course, very true. And art historians, that was your question, have dealt with this for generations, arguing that without circumstance, ambience, without literature, without philosophy, you cannot understand a picture. But this is not the final sentence. Peter Geimer, the historian of photography, continuously argues that the human being expects a radical, direct reality in the picture. That is why, notwithstanding all constructivistic theories that we have brought forward arguing this is not true, that is why a number of billion photographs go around the world each day, selfies. And this is the one point, and the second is that in the picture-active sense, pictures play this role of immediacy, what Leonardo calls subito, now, what Barmet Munoz says, now. The picture is, the sublime is now, without time to read, creates political spheres. One picture is that of Fukuyama, where the German government overnight, and our chancellor is extremely sensible for pictures, overnight, 3 months after the prolongation of atomic industry went through the Bundestag for more than 15 years. In one night, she decided, after having seen the pictures, we don't know anything, we abandon atomic industry. And the second event was the picture of the 86 dead people close to Vienna in the lorry of chicken food, where 86 people, children, women, men, died. She was at the Assembly of Ministers where they talked about the crisis of refugees. Overnight, she said, open the frontiers. Turned 180 degrees the wheel. So there is the coup d'oeil, what I talked about in the Festschrift for Wolfram Hochreber. I wonder if he's here. The subito, the immediacy that reality is in the picture still continues. Nevertheless, that everything you said is true. It's not the final
I agree entirely with what you're saying, that photographs convey immediacy. My point is that it's a different kind of immediacy. And I can illustrate that, especially when you're talking about video images. Let me give you an example. If you go to southern France, to Aix-en-Provence, and you go up to the Terrain des Peintres, where Cézanne, just above Cézanne's workshop, about a kilometer, and there's this fantastic Terrain des Peintres, and that's where he stood in the last years of his life when he was painting these fabulous views of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire. And my example would be this. You know, if you go to Aix-en-Provence, you go up to the Terrain des Peintres, and you look at the Montagne Sainte-Victoire, just as Cézanne did. It's still fabulous, fantastic view at different times of day. And you compare that, I mean, you take three different ways of representing images. You take that and you compare it with the painting of Cézanne himself. You go to Paris, you go to the 4th floor of the Picasso Museum, and you look at Picasso's own Cézanne, the famous Montagne Sainte-Victoire vue des Louvres, in which Picasso said this is where Cubism began. It's a fantastic painting in his own private collection that you can see in Paris, and you have this view of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire, which is also a representation. And then you can see on television, I've seen different reportages of Cézanne or of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire, in which you see in a video presentation the same scene. In other words, somebody taking a picture on a video from the Terrain des Peintres. What I'm saying is that these are three different ways. This is not a judgment of any kind, but these are three different ways, three different forms of immediacy that are extremely different, that interact with one another, for sure, but that nonetheless are different. Whether you're talking about the immediate view that I have of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire, the famous painting of Cézanne that was the beginning of Cubism, according to Picasso, and the video that you're showing, either of one of Cézanne's paintings or of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire itself. What I'm saying is that there's a spatio-temporal, and even, I would say, a spatio-temporal configuration in the three cases, which is different, and which cannot be assimilated the one to the other. And we're talking, one other example, if I can abuse your time, is something we were talking about at breakfast again. It's the fantastic essay. I mean, this is something that changed my life when I read it. It's the famous Zwischenbetrachtung, Zwischenerörterung of Georg Simmel in his fabulous book on Rembrandt. And the name of the Zwischenerörterung is Was sehen wir am Kunstwerk? What do we see when we look at a work of art? And he takes as an example a fantastic painting of Rembrandt of his mother. And the painting of his mother, there's a Pelzkragen, fur collar. And Simmel says, you know, look at the painting. And it's incredible. Rembrandt, with a few strokes of his pen, because the lithograph, if I remember correctly, or no, a pen etching, a few strokes of his pen, he's able to convey to us not only the Pelzkragen, but he's able to make us feel the texture, the fact that this is fur that we are seeing. And you know, he says, this is not a photograph. You cannot. It's not the same thing. It's not the same tactile value that is communicated by the photograph. That there's something in looking at the painting of Rembrandt, even though there are just a few lines. I mean, it's not something that it's almost practically a symbol or a representation that's almost abstract, but you immediately see this is a fur collar in Simmel's Was sehen wir am Kunstwerk, which shows, it seems to me, that there is a kind of that for me was an incredible experience, just reading that passage. Oh my God, you think of all the possibilities. I don't know if I'm answering your question, and I'm sure you have an answer. But anyway.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Barash.
Thank you.